Agriculture transformed human existence. For most of human history, people survived by hunting and gathering, moving frequently in small groups. Around 12,000 years ago, communities in the Fertile Crescent began cultivating wild grains and domesticating animals. This shift marked the beginning of settled life. Early farmers faced immediate challenges. Wild wheat and barley required careful selection over generations to produce reliable yields. Communities learned to store surplus grain, protect it from pests, and distribute it through seasons of scarcity. These practices demanded new forms of organization and cooperation. Permanent settlements emerged as agriculture became more productive. Villages grew into towns, then cities. Population increased steadily in regions where farming succeeded. Archaeological evidence indicates that early agricultural societies in Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus River Basin, and northern China all followed similar patterns of growth. Agriculture created surplus, and surplus created complexity. Not everyone needed to produce food directly. Specialized roles emerged. Craftspeople, traders, administrators, and religious leaders became possible because farmers could feed more than just themselves. Evidence suggests that this division of labor accelerated around 6,000 years ago. Storage and distribution required coordination. Communities developed systems to manage grain reserves, allocate water for irrigation, and organize planting cycles. These systems eventually became institutions. Temples often served as storage centers and redistribution points. Administrative records from ancient Sumer show detailed accounts of grain stocks, labor obligations, and resource allocation. Irrigation expanded agricultural capacity significantly. Farmers in river valleys constructed canals, dikes, and water management systems. These projects required collective effort and ongoing maintenance. Historians suggest that the need to coordinate large-scale irrigation contributed to the development of centralized authority in early states. Agricultural societies became dependent on their own success. As populations grew, communities needed ever larger harvests to sustain themselves. Fields that once seemed abundant eventually showed signs of exhaustion. Soil fertility declined in regions where the same crops were planted repeatedly without adequate rest periods or nutrient replacement. Environmental pressures accumulated gradually. Deforestation for farmland altered local climates and water cycles. Irrigation, when poorly managed, led to salt accumulation in soil, reducing productivity over generations. Research points to salinization as a major factor in the decline of agricultural output in southern Mesopotamia after centuries of intensive farming. Climate variability affected all early agricultural societies. Droughts, floods, and temperature shifts disrupted harvests. Unlike mobile hunter-gatherers who could relocate when conditions worsened, settled farmers had invested everything in fixed locations. Storage systems helped buffer short-term shocks, but prolonged environmental stress tested the limits of any society's resilience. Economic strain followed agricultural decline. When harvests fell, surplus disappeared. Specialized workers depended on that surplus. Trade networks weakened when communities had less to exchange. Administrative systems designed for abundance struggled when scarcity became persistent rather than temporary. Social structures also faced pressure during extended periods of reduced productivity. Inequality often increased as elites controlled remaining resources. Evidence indicates that during times of stress, wealth became more concentrated while common farmers faced greater hardship. This imbalance could weaken social cohesion over time. The relationship between farmers and authorities grew more tense when productivity declined. Tax obligations and labor requirements remained constant or increased even as yields diminished. Communities that had prospered through cooperation found themselves divided between those who extracted resources and those who struggled to produce them. Historical records from various regions suggest that resentment and social fragmentation often preceded broader institutional breakdown. Administrative complexity, once an advantage, sometimes became a burden. Large bureaucracies required significant resources to maintain. When agricultural output declined, supporting extensive administrative systems consumed a greater share of available surplus. Records from various ancient civilizations suggest that institutional overhead continued even as the productive base contracted. Knowledge transmission also suffered during periods of prolonged decline. Agricultural techniques, irrigation maintenance, and administrative practices depended on training new generations. When communities fragmented or populations dispersed, specialized knowledge could be lost. Historians note that some societies experienced a reduction in technical capacity, as experienced farmers, engineers, and scribes were not adequately replaced. This loss of expertise made recovery more difficult even when environmental conditions improved. Adaptability determined which societies endured. Some communities modified their agricultural practices, diversified crops, or developed new technologies. Others remained committed to established methods even as conditions changed. Historical patterns show that flexibility in responding to environmental and economic shifts often separated societies that recovered from those that continued to decline. Collapse, when it occurred, rarely happened suddenly. Most agricultural civilizations experienced gradual weakening over decades or centuries. Urban centers slowly lost population. Trade diminished. Administrative control contracted. What appears in the historical record as a dramatic endpoint was usually the final stage of a long process of accumulated stress. Agriculture enabled civilization, but it also created vulnerabilities. Dependence on specific crops, fixed settlements, and complex institutions meant that environmental changes, resource depletion, and systemic pressures could compound over time. The decline of early agricultural societies demonstrates that success itself can generate conditions that eventually undermine stability. These lessons remain relevant, reminding us that even robust systems require careful stewardship and the willingness to adapt when foundational conditions change. Understanding these patterns reveals that collapse was not the result of a single failure, but rather the gradual accumulation of pressures that overwhelmed the capacity of systems to adapt.